Hello, and welcome to the Poetry 3 unit. In this unit, you will study areas of poetry, focusing on various methods such as form and its effect, as well as considering how to approach the unseen poetry section of the examination. This is all in preparation for the study of poetry from across the ages and unseen poetry, which you may well have already started in Poetry 1 and Poetry 2. You may have these units on your timeline already, but if you don't, you may wish to take a quick look at them for more information. As said in Poetry 1 and Poetry 2, the study of poetry is a requirement of all the examination boards, whichever one you end up teaching, and they all have an anthology of poetry that students need to study. This anthology will consist of about 15 poems that students will need to have detailed knowledge and understanding of, as all examinations are closed text now, so they won't be able to take their anthologies into the examination room with them. Whereas Poetry 1 focused very much upon literary and poetic techniques, such as similes and metaphors, etc., and then Poetry 2 moved into more challenging techniques, such as mapping out rhyme schemes and identifying rhythm, Poetry 3 moves into the final level of challenge, that of looking at form and then transferring all knowledge gained to the unseen poems. One of the things to remember with any of the methods discussed in Poetry 1, Poetry 2 and here in Poetry 3 is that they all fit into the requirements of AO2 in particular and the analysis of the writer's methods. To remind you, AO2 is analyse the language, form and structure used by a writer to create meanings and effects, using relevant subject terminology where appropriate. As we said in Poetry 2, if we then look at the mark scheme for AQA English Literature, for example, Level 6, the top level, has very clear instructions as to what a student needs to do when analysing any literature text for AO2, including poetry. It states, there will be a fine-grained and insightful analysis of language and form and structure, supported by judicious use of subject terminology. The significant wording to notice here is language and form and structure. This is not the case with lower levels of the mark scheme, where it refers to language and or structure and or form. The implication here is clear. We need to talk about form, amongst other methods, in order to be able to reach the top grades. As a result, being confident with different forms of poetry means we can enable our students and provide them with the necessary knowledge and skills to access the higher level interpretations and ideas. As with any methods that we learn from any units on this blackboard though, it's not sufficient that we simply feature spot what has been used, but that we draw the connections between those methods and why the writer has used them. Just like language features and structure, form is simply another method that the poet has used to express or shape their ideas. As I mentioned back in Poetry 2, in terms of teaching poetry, I tend to follow the same structure each time in order to provide a framework for students to use when approaching any poem, as well as encouraging them to use ideas from the 4 strands of analysis, which I've also mentioned before in other units and will remind you of here later on. The poetry units on this blackboard move you through that framework, starting with spotting and analysing the effect of more obvious literary features such as similes, etc., before taking all these ideas and making the links to the structure, and then lastly, the form of the poem. When you think about the wording of AO2, writer's methods, we need to remember that structure and form are not to be scared of. They are indeed simply other methods that the writer has used to convey their ideas, so they are just as eligible for analysis as the language used. This framework of approach is then invaluable for students to use when they are faced with unseen poetry in the examination. Approaching 15 poems in the same way hopefully removes any fears and concerns that they may have about how to approach the unseen poetry. By the time that they have studied even 3 or 4 poems from the anthology in the same way, it begins to become ingrained, and they know precisely what steps to take when looking at an unseen poem. After all the poems in the anthology cluster are unseen before they study them. By doing this, hopefully it will help to reduce any panic about what to do and instill confidence for what is, for many, the most challenging part of the English literature examination papers. So the first set of activities in your Prepare section for this unit will begin with form and helping you to pin down what it is, especially in comparison to structure, where it can be difficult to see the difference between the two. I tend to think of form as almost the genre of the poem. What type is it, i.e. ballad, sonnet, etc. And the structure is then how the poem is put together within that form. For more ideas on structural devices to identify, refer back to the introductory video for Poetry 2, which will take you through half a dozen questions that I always use for pinning down structural devices. For those of you who are unfamiliar with different forms of poems, this is precisely what the next part of the Prepare section is for. Here, you will be introduced to many different forms, including narrative, ballad, lyric, ode, dramatic monologue, free verse, sonnet, etc., and some examples of them. One thing to consider when teaching these different forms of poetry is that we don't necessarily have to teach them discreetly. Very rarely will I walk into the classroom when studying the anthology poetry with the intent of delivering a lesson on, say, ballads. Instead, it's more about using the anthology and the poems in it as a springboard to introducing different forms to them. The 15 poems will undoubtedly cover a range of forms. In addition, it's also very important to remember that some poems are not easily identifiable as merely one form or another. Clearly, there are some that are obvious to identify, mainly because of their structure. A sonnet, for example, has a clear set of rules about the content and the structure of its composition. Other forms aren't so easily recognisable simply by structural rules. Odes, for example, come in lots of different versions, i.e. the Pindaric, the English, etc., and are more easily identifiable by the tone that they use, that celebratory praising of someone or something, rather than structure. As a result, rather than encouraging them to think about a poem being definitely one form, it might be more sensible to guide them towards finding elements of a form within a poem, always stressing that it could have elements of more than one form about it. For example, The Charge of the Light Brigade is clearly a narrative, in the use of the narrative arc, the third-person narrator, etc., but there's also no doubt that it has elements of the ode about it with the tone, where Tennyson instructs that we honour the noble 600. Finally, on form, you will have a good look at sonnets and the 2 different types of them, the Petrarchan and the Shakespearean. As I just said, sonnets are easier to identify because of the strict structural rules of 14 lines of iambic pentameter, specific rhyme scheme, etc. And of course they are used most famously by Shakespeare, even in his plays, such as Romeo and Juliet's first lines with each other. Again, as with any of these forms, it's about thinking about why the poet has chosen that form. Even more interesting is sometimes looking at how that form has been subverted. For example, in Shelley's Ozymandias, there are moments where he plays with the traditional structural rules of the sonnet form in order to satirise Ozymandias further. Once you've got to grips with those different forms, the Prepare section then moves you on to the unseen poetry element of the examination. giving you the opportunity to look at question paper, mark scheme, etc. There are a few things to consider when approaching the unseen poetry. Firstly, as we've already said earlier, encourage them to use the same steps that they have used to approach the anthology poems for the unseen poems. That way, they are giving themselves the opportunity to access ideas about language, structure, and form, as well as considering the poet's ideas and themes. Secondly, encourage them to transfer the knowledge that they have gained from the study of 15 poems to the unseen poems. By that, I mean try and find the links and use what they already know. For example, if they are looking at a poem of 1 stanza in length, like Maya Angelou's On Aging, which has come up before as an unseen poem, I would want them to think about other poems that they have studied that have also been of 1 stanza in length. Teaching the Power and Conflict anthology for AQA as I do, I would hope that they would think of Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney. At that point, they should then be asking themselves what the effect of the 1 stanza structure was in Storm on the Island, hopefully remembering ideas along the lines of it representing the incessant nature of the storm and the power of nature itself, the lack of stanza breaks meaning there is no respite from it. At that point, can they use the same interpretation for the unseen poem? Does Angelou use the 1 stanza structure in On Aging to represent the incessant nature of aging and the power of time, with the lack of stanza breaks once again representing the lack of respite from, in this case, the process of aging? As you can see here, this is what I mean by transferring knowledge, and this is something that they can do with language, structure and form, helping them to think of interpretations and ideas. The study section contains various tasks which will give you the opportunity to put your new knowledge into practice. The first thing that you are asked to do is to look at various different examples of different forms of poems and to consider the effect of the form. Start by feature spotting, then move into analysing the effect of the form, thinking about developing your ideas into the how of the effect of the method. Remember to explain fully not just what is achieved, but also how it is done so. The assignment task then gives you the opportunity to undertake an unseen poetry section of an examination paper, looking at both questions. Pay attention to the added instructions I've given you here with regards to the timing of the questions, given how many marks are available for each question, as well as the anticipated length of them as a result. As always, you're aiming for AO1 and AO2. AO3 isn't assessed in this section of the examination paper for AQA. The end of unit assignment tasks moves into looking at a student exemplar response to 2 poems from the poetry anthology. Here, you are asked to move back into the role of teacher, considering the response against the mark scheme and assessing it against AO1, AO2 and AO3, as well as focusing upon particularly how the student has addressed elements of form or not. For both the assignment and end of unit assignment, don't forget that when it comes to analysing, as has been mentioned elsewhere, we have the 4 strands of analysis, which you may have come across on other units. Firstly, subject terminology and methods. Start with pinning down the actual technique used, preferably using the correct terminology. Secondly, connotations. Consider if there are associations attached to the language chosen and used by the writer. What does it suggest or make us think of, etc.? Thirdly, effect upon the reader. You are the reader. What does it make you think or feel? And most importantly, how is it doing that? Think about your response to what you are reading and how the writer is eliciting that response. Lastly, authorial intentions. At this point, Consider what you think the writer is trying to achieve in what they're saying. There will be a message or theme or purpose to what has been written or included, and we need to think about what they are trying to say to us, the reader, and why that might be. These strands of analysis are exactly the kinds of things that we want to see students doing in their examination responses on all texts, making it very obvious to the examiner that they are addressing all the aspects of AO2 from the mark scheme. So do consider them when answering the unseen poem questions in the assignment. Hopefully, this leaves you a little clearer as to the relevance of the tasks here in this unit and how they link with the requirements of the study of poetry. So now it's over to you to work your way through the prepare and study sections of this unit. Good luck. Thank you.